Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. Let's face it, there are certain things that most breeders would probably prefer you didn't know about boa breeding. But these are really important things to keep in mind if you're going to pursue the hobby of keeping and breeding these amazing animals. Today I'm going to count down the top 12 things that most boa breeders would prefer you didn't know. So if you're planning on picking up any boas in the near future, be sure to stay tuned. So first of all, I want to say that there are a lot of great boa breeders out there. This isn't meant to be an attack on boa breeders by any means. And many of the things that I'm going to discuss don't apply to most boa breeders. Some of them don't apply to, or some boa breeders, none of them apply to. But these are definitely things that you should keep in mind just so you're better informed if you're planning on building your boa collection. And unfortunately, there are a few breeders out there that are sometimes less transparent than they should be. So hopefully this video will give you some ideas about what to ask the breeders the next time you're thinking about picking up one of their boas. So the first thing that they probably prefer that you don't know is that their bloodlines aren't necessarily any more special than anyone else's bloodlines. And I know a lot of people will tag the name of the bloodline. Typically it's a famous boa breeder like Rio Bravo or Fudo or something like that. And while it's great to have this information for your records, it doesn't necessarily mean that the animal is any more spectacular or beautiful or desirable than an animal that doesn't have one of these fancy names. And they might do a similar thing with some of the localities, some of the ultra specific localities like the Pokagon Suriname, or something very specific like that. But really, I tell people, look at the boa. Don't look at the description, look at the boa. Do you like the boa? Is the boa beautiful? Is it spectacular? Does it take your breath away? If you're answering no to these questions but just buying a boa because of some fancy name, then you probably should rethink why you're buying this boa. Many of the boa breeders that established these bloodlines however many decades ago were just working with the animals that were available to them at the time. And often there's not a huge supply of many boas, especially the locality boas. So they may have taken what they could get to start their breeding group. So again, the designer name and designer label doesn't necessarily mean the boa is any better. Look closely at the boa. Its appearance, its coloration, its pattern when you're making your decision about if it's desirable or not. The second thing a boa breeder might not want you to know is that they haven't mastered the process of boa breeding. And I hope if you've learned anything from watching my videos is that breeding boas is a never-ending learning experience. Even after doing it for many years, I still learn something new every year. And this is why I like these animals. It's very challenging. It's, not formulaic. You have to figure out figure out what works best for you. You can't just follow some recipe that someone has determined in the past for optimal breeding. And so a lot of people might want you to think that they figured it out and that, they know exactly how to make their boas reproduce at all times. But the truth is, I don't think there's anybody that breeds boas who's honest, who has mastered the process. There's always going to be something new to learn about breeding boas and how to make it work a little more efficiently and a little better. The third thing that your boa breeder might not want you to know is that for any given breeding trial, they probably don't have as much of a handle on what's going on as they would like you to believe. And I often see pictures online where someone posts two boas in a breeding trial, and they say that the female is now 5 days past the pre-ovulation swell, heading into the 3rd day of ovulation, and they expect that the post-ovulation shed will happen on this date, and on this date they'll have a litter of 19 babies or something like that. And they make it sound like they know exactly what's going on at any given point. And so I really take this with a grain of salt, and I'm somewhat skeptical of these claims. When I pair my boas, I basically put the male and female together and I let them do their thing. I try not to disturb them. I don't want to interfere with their breeding activities. At the most, I'll check in a few times a week. If I don't need to move them out of the enclosures, I don't do that because I don't want to disturb them. And I don't know. I'll be totally honest with you. I rarely know until the late spring which of my animals appear gravid and what I'm expecting. And I know a lot of you guys asked me, do you think you're going to have Tarahumara boas this year? Do you think you're going to have Hog Islands or Amorali boas? And I can't tell you for sure because I'm doing my best and I have the pairs together, and in many cases I'm seeing signs of activity, but I don't know exactly where I am in the process. And honestly, I prefer not to know. It's a surprise. I'm just going to let the boas do their thing, and hopefully I'll end up with some really nice boas. Typically I do every year. Typically I have some disappointments and some litters don't take, or breedings don't take. That's part of the fun of boa breeding. So I'm really skeptical that people know exactly where they are at every step of the process with a boa breeding trial. The fourth thing your boa breeder might not want you knowing is that they're probably not as selective in setting up their breeding group or choosing their breeding pairs as they might want you to believe. You may have come under the impression that people are carefully, boa breeders are carefully screening many boas when setting up a breeding group. They want to find the perfect example with the right color, the right pattern that goes exactly well with the other animal that they're pairing it up with. And you might also get this impression that they want to do something like this when they set up a breeding pair. When they're going through their breeding colony, they know that this particular female is going to go perfectly with this particular male, and they have it down to this, art and science. It's like, the perfect recipe for pairing up the genes of a boa for best results. The truth is, boa breeders, in many cases, only have a limited number of boas to choose from. The animals available for sale, in many cases, you're only looking at a few individual animals of a given locality that are available any given year. And most of the locality boas are not really exported from the wild in any amounts these days, so there's a relatively limited gene pool. Similarly, when a boa breeder is pairing up boas, they're pairing up what they have. And in many cases, many boa breeders only have one pair of a given locality. Even people with relatively large breeding groups like myself, we may have large breeding groups for a few localities, but then other localities we're dealing with just a single pair. So there's not really much we can do as far as selecting between, breeding pairs. It's just one male, one female. That's what's going to be paired up. So, that's just a fact of life with boa breeding. Some cases you don't have quite the choice that you ideally would want. We can't just go to Boas R Us and pick from hundreds of different boas. We're just limited to the boas that are commercially available on the market. The fifth thing your boa breeder may not want you knowing is that they may or may not be into boa breeding for the right reasons. And so everyone that breeds boas does it for a little bit different of a reason, although there's a lot of commonalities that motivate many people to produce these spectacular animals. And I have to say that it basically boils down to three different motivations for breeding boas. So the first is just the love of the boas. We just love these animals. We're fascinated by them. They're beautiful. They're great to have around. We just really relate to them. They calm us down, lower our blood pressure, etc. And I think most boa breeders have some inherent love for the boas. Otherwise, they really wouldn't be working with them all that much. The second main motivator is the social aspect. So people like the social part of breeding boas, interacting with other breeders, going to the shows, going to boa reptile societies and hearing lectures and talks, watching YouTube videos, making YouTube videos, etc. It's just reaching out to other people that are interested in boas to get your message across. And then the third motivator is obviously the money. So some people are doing this because they want to get money, or they're driven by the monetary rewards for breeding boas. And of course, boa breeding isn't cheap. We need to take in a certain amount of money just to keep in business and just to have another year of boa breeding. So monetary considerations are obviously going to play a role as well. And I would say that most boa breeders are a mixture of these three motivators. I would say for myself, my primary motivator is the first. I just love boas. I've always been into reptiles. I love these animals. They just fascinate me, and I always feel a sense of calm when I take out my boa and handle it, and all of the troubles of the day just kind of go away when I'm holding my boa. It's very relaxing. As far as the second motivator, the social aspect, I am really not a social person. I'm more of an introvert. I've just always been that way. In fact, I really have to push myself to do the social part of it just so that I can continue breeding Boas. And you know, this whole YouTube channel is part of that. Never thought I would have done this a few years ago, but here I am letting it all hang out and making these YouTube videos several times a week so you can hear what's going on inside my head about these Boas. And then the third aspect, obviously the money does play a role. Boa breeding ain't cheap, and it's only getting more expensive every year. So we really do need to be taking in some money to, you know, to keep the electricity on and to keep the rodent shipments coming so we can continue to breed. You know, that being said, it's up to you to determine what the primary motivator is for your Boa breeder and if it's the right one. You know, if a breeder is primarily motivated by the money, is this somebody that you really want to deal with? You know, are they going to take shortcuts and maybe not look into their Boa's best interest because they're primarily motivated by the money? Of course, when you ask someone why they breed Boas, they're not going to just come out and say that. So again, it's up to you to determine, based on the breeder's reputation and based on word of mouth and what other customers of the breeder have told you, what their primary motivating factor is. And again, I think most people are motivated by a combination of these three things, so it's not wrong to be motivated by the money. It's just something you have to take into account when you're looking at the other motivating factors for breeding Boas. The sixth thing that a Boa breeder may not want you knowing is that his or her Boas may not be feeding and established. And I've always said in my videos, you know, one of the very important parts of breeding is to establish the baby Boas. So once the baby Boas are born, that's by no means the end of the process. You have to get them feeding and ready to go so they'll have their best chance of a great start when they reach their new homes. So it's really very questionable for anybody to be selling Boas right after they're born, or you know, before they've eaten several times and it's, you know, apparent that they're in good health. But I've heard many stories about people who bought Boas and they didn't know it, but the Boa was literally born a few days before. And it often happens at shows because people that go to shows are on a schedule. The show is on August 30th. So people need to have the Boas ready by August 30th. So maybe the Boa was born on August 28th. Well, no problems. Get him in the little deli cup, get them off to the show, sell them to somebody. And somebody might not ask the right questions. So it's possible you may buy a Boa that hasn't been fed yet, you know, which in some cases the Boa will eat on its own. But there are many types of Boas, such as the island Boas, that need to be established. And of the Boas I breed, the island Boas are the most notorious for not eating. In my experience, the Hog Island Boas like this one, about a third of my baby Hog Island Boas don't eat on their own. So they have to be assist fed, and they can take anywhere from 4 to 6 months to get them established to where they're ready for their new home. I always, for whatever reason, the Hog Islands have been kind of my Achilles heel as far as the babies. My Pearl Islands, Honduran Firebellies, and Claw Key Boas, typically I'll have like maybe 1 or 2 babies per litter that don't feed right away. But these Hog Islands, there's always, you know, quite a few that don't feed. So be sure that you're not getting a Boa that was just literally born the day before. You want to make sure you have an established Boa that's ready to go, you know, for the best odds of success. And yes, I have heard anecdotes from people about established Boa breeders that were literally selling Boas, you know, within a week of birth. The seventh thing your Boa breeder probably doesn't want you knowing, if it applies to them, is that they might be a flipper. And so if you're not familiar with the practice of flipping, this is where somebody buys a Boa or a litter of Boas from one breeder, and then they turn around and sell them to other people in a short period of time, anywhere from weeks to months, often at a much higher price. It's almost like they're doing this similar thing to what people do with houses or, you know, commodities or things like that. And you know, Boas, they're not baseball cards, so it's really not in their best interest that they be bought and sold like this and, you know, move from one place to another. Anytime a Boa goes to a new home, it's going to face some unavoidable amount of stress, even if it's not a flipper. But when you have a Boa being rehomed and being shipped all around multiple times, it just increases this unavoidable stress. In addition, some people might try to hide the fact that they're flipping, and if you ask them about the breeding information, they might not answer your questions about, you know, when they were bred, or, you know, what the breeding stock was, or they might kind of, you know, change the subject, things like that. You know, flipping by itself is not inherently immoral. It's obviously not illegal, and there are people who buy litters from big breeders that maybe don't have the time to, you know, sell them, and that's understandable. So I don't want to say that it's always wrong to resell an animal like this. In fact, I've even gotten a few animals that someone had purchased from a breeder, and they just kind of got out pretty quickly, and, you know, it worked well for me and it worked well for them because, you know, their Boas got to go to a good home. In addition, many times people will have a Boa for a few years, and then they, you know, for whatever reason, they get out of the hobby or their focus changes and they sell it to someone else. You know, that's unavoidable. If you hold a Boa for, you know, a year or longer, it's really not, doesn't meet the definition of flipping. At that point, it's, you know, being rehomed. So, you know, although flipping is not completely wrong, it might be something that you want to avoid, you know, buying a flipped Boa. So you might definitely want to ask questions carefully if you're suspecting that the breeder is trying to flip a Boa on you. The eighth thing your Boa breeder might not want you knowing is that their Boa pricing strategy might be completely unrealistic. In fact, they might just be completely shooting the moon and completely overvaluing what their Boa is actually worth. And I follow the online classifieds a lot just to keep an eye on the Boa market and how prices are trending. And I'll often see a situation where there might be a locality Boa and the going rate is somewhere in, let's say, the $800 to $1,000 range. And you see a lot of ads in that price range. But then suddenly there's someone that has a similar looking Boa and they're pricing it at $4,000. And they might make some kind of claim about, you know, how great it is, or, you know, have some reason that they're claiming it's, you know, so much better than other people's Boas. But I think what it boils down to is they're emotionally bonded to this Boa. You know, they don't really want to let go, and they have this unrealistic expectation of its value. And so often they just put these ads up because they figure, yeah, there's no way in hell that anyone is going to pay that much for this Boa. But hey, at least I'm making it available and out there. And there, you know, who knows? There might just be somebody that has that kind of money and they want to part with it. And in that case, they get a really good payout and they can use it to buy other Boas or to buy equipment or whatever. I also often wonder if this is a technique that they're using to manipulate the Boa market. So if they put out all these really expensive prices, people will see them, and then eventually they'll think, well, that must be what these Boas are selling for. And, you know, this might be a particular Boa that there's only a handful of animals available at any given time. So it's not that hard for one person to, you know, really have a big impact on the pricing and the market for that particular type of Boa. And if people see this long enough and, you know, maybe somebody does actually pay these exorbitant prices, that's kind of the new normal. And then they're going to push it up even more. So I often wonder about that. So really, you know, do yourself a favor. If you're looking to buy Boas, understand the Boa market, follow the classified, see what things are going for, ask friends who bought Boas what they paid, just so that you can protect yourself from some of these pricing exercises that many Boa breeders will do. The ninth thing that many Boa breeders would prefer you didn't know is also related to pricing, kind of in the opposite direction, and that is that many Boa breeders don't really make a lot of money, if any money at all, breeding Boas. And so we see these exorbitant prices, Boas in the multiple thousands of dollar range, Boas whose price has increased from $200 to $1,000 in the last 5 years, and you might be tempted to think that the Boa breeders are really cashing in on their hobby. But the truth is that most Boa breeders are barely breaking even. In fact, if we just consider everybody that is aspiring to breed Boas, the vast majority of people won't even be successful in producing a single litter because they're just going to give up before they reach you know, success, because Boa breeding is hard and it takes a long time and a lot of perseverance. And then even if we look at people who are already successfully breeding and have produced multiple litters in the past, most of them are not making a huge amount of money. You know, some of us are just making barely enough to cover our overhead costs, you know, the cost of the prey items and substrate and electricity. And, you know, any money that we have just goes back into the Boas, you know, so that we can continue doing this and producing more boas. In fact, if you think about someone even with a relatively large collection of boas, let's say they have 60 female and 40 male boas, only like half of those might be, reproductive age. So let's say they have 30 female boas that could breed, but on any given year they're only breeding half of them, so that's 15 female boas. And then if they're lucky, maybe they get half to 2/3 success rate, of the pairings leads to a successful litter. So we're talking about somewhere in the order of, 8 to 10 litters. And then another thing to consider is that litters are often much smaller than most people think. So if you just open up a book about boas, a general book about boas, you might get this idea that a typical litter is 20 or 30, and it's not uncommon to get litters of 40, 50, or even more. But when we're talking about locality boas, it's not uncommon to get litters of just a few boas, maybe even 3 or 4 boas for a first-time breeder. And then, a typical boa litter size for many locality boas, like many red tails, is probably somewhere on the order of, 12 to 18 boas. Any litter larger than 20 is one of the larger litters, and you can't really count on getting litters that big, at least not with locality boas. I've heard that a lot of morph boas do put out bigger litters. So all this adds up is that most people are not really taking in a lot of money, and with the expenses going up every year, it's getting more and more expensive to do this hobby, even if the boa prices are going up. So most boa breeders are probably not making as much money as they probably want the public to believe. The 10th thing that most boa breeders would probably prefer you didn't know is a really big thing when it comes to locality boas. And as we know, the whole idea behind locality boas is the specific location where the breeding stock originated and where your animals bred in captivity can trace their origin back to either a country of origin like Suriname or Guyana, or more specifically a region of origin or even a village like Pocogran, Suriname, or Tamatama, Venezuela. But the truth is that very few breeders can be 100% sure that their boa really did truly originate from that particular location. And I mean the breeding stock that produced that particular boa. And so the fact is that very few boa breeders, if any at all really, have actually collected the animals from the wild because of all of the complex laws that surround exporting wildlife, as well as the fact that most countries in the range of the boa constrictor are closed to export. So you can't just go on a vacation to Brazil and come back with a few true red tails in your suitcase. So we have to depend upon the reports of the exporters in many cases. You may have some breeding stock of red-tailed boas that were supposedly exported from Suriname, but it's been notoriously difficult to determine 100% where the animals actually came from. It was not that uncommon in the past. Maybe Suriname was closed for export, so people would take boas from Suriname that were caught in Suriname and export them out of Guyana. And as I've discussed in the past, it's virtually impossible, if not impossible, to differentiate a Guyana from a Suriname boa just based on the physical appearance. So for example, this animal is, as far as I know, a Suriname. It's a specific bloodline. It contains some Fudo bloodline, some wild-caught bloodline, as well as the Florida Redtails bloodline was the mother of this animal. So I know what I've been told about the animals that produced this particular animal. This is a 2018 animal born here in my facility, but I can't 100% prove it because I'm just going on what people told me. And I have it in good faith. I trust these people. I don't think they're trying to deceive me, but they're just going based on what they were told. Okay, and it kind of goes back. So even if everyone is completely honest and transparent, if you trace back the original transaction, the original capture of the breeding stock from the wild and the information was wrong, that mistake is going to be perpetuated. So I can't 100% prove this is a Suriname boa. It's consistent with Suriname boas. It looks like a Suriname boa. I can go online. I can see pictures of other people's Suriname boas that it's consistent with. I can go to iNaturalist and I can look at pictures of boas in the wild from Suriname with the GPS coordinates, and it's consistent with that. So I don't have any reason not to believe it's Suriname. But again, I can't be 100% sure that it's Suriname. And that's just part of the something that you really have to accept if you're going to be in locality boas. is that you have really no way of being completely 100% sure in most cases of the origin of your boa. In addition, some people think that they can just simply have the boa's DNA tested and they get a breed report that says that it's Suriname or Guyana or whatever. Well, we don't have that technology, or we don't have that service available. It would be, in theory, you could make a boa breed DNA profile just like they have for purebred dogs now. But I don't think that anytime soon it's going to be commercially feasible for somebody to invest the money to set this up. So I'm not holding my breath on boa DNA profiling to determine the locality. So again, something you just have to accept. I don't think that this, tarnishes the fact that this is a beautiful boa and that it's, 99.99% certain to be from Suriname. I'm just saying that you can't say 100% that it's from Suriname, because you're just going based on what the breeders have told you and, based on the documentation, which all it takes is one mistake in the chain of custody to have the wrong information perpetuated. The 11th thing your boa breeder probably doesn't want you knowing is related to the 10th thing I just discussed, and it's that the paperwork that accompanies your boa to prove that it's of the stated locality might be absolutely worthless. And so some people are under the impression that they can get papers for boas that are similar to the papers for dogs. So with dogs, you have the American Kennel Club, which tracks the pedigrees of all these purebred dogs, and they can go back many generations. And if you have the paperwork, you can be reasonably confident that the animal you have is agreed on by the experts, the American Kennel Club, to be of the stated breed. However, there's no such club or organization that is certifying boas. It's all based on trust of the seller and the reputation of the seller. So by papers, this can mean a number of different things. Most sellers, or most reputable sellers, will include a receipt with their boa, and the best ones will include the particular bloodline of the boa and specific information about the boa as they know. But again, this is often just based on what the person that they got the boa from told them. So there's definitely some faith there. Sometimes they have a boa that comes from a notable breeder, and there's a lot of notable breeders that have a really great reputation and you can really trust, and they're not going to deceive you. So that's should make you feel a little bit better that the paperwork means something. But again, all that has to happen is that there's one mistake along the whole chain, going back to the original wild-caught, breeding stock, for the mistake to be perpetuated. It doesn't need to involve deceit on the part of any of the breeders. And then another type of paperwork are the CITES documents. This is a paperwork that accompanies shipments of boas, as dictated by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. You need this paperwork that says the scientific name of the boa, the number in the shipment, and then the port of export. And so sometimes people will provide this with their boas, a copy of it, and so that should give you some comfort that the animal is descended from animals that actually came from this CITES export port. However, there's some problems with this. It doesn't really say on the paperwork exactly where the animal came from. It just says, for example, Iquitos, Peru. So if you have a red-tailed boa and you can be confident that the CITES paperwork accompanying from it says Iquitos, Peru, and that's the right paperwork, you can be somewhat comfortable that it came out of Iquitos, Peru. However, Peruvian boas are caught from many miles around and they're just exported out of Iquitos. So you don't know exactly where it originated. And then the other problem is that there's nothing in the CITES paperwork identifying that specific boa. So anybody could switch it. They could take any boa and they could have a copy of the CITES paperwork and say, well, this paperwork accompanies this boa, and there's no way you could tell. So it comes back to faith in the seller and how much you trust the seller. Unfortunately, there's no paperwork that is going to be completely safe from deception or safe from being switched around like this. And then there's the worst type of paperwork, which is basically somebody just writes on a piece of paper a certificate of authenticity. This is a true Suriname red-tailed boa. And anybody could write anything and try to pass it off as some kind of official paperwork. I've even seen a breeder that had something about the German reptile nature registry or something like that. It looked like it was this phony organization that they concocted to give some kind of legitimacy to their certificates of authenticity, but it was just looked very phony to me, and I think anybody would see right through that. So it just comes down to your faith in the breeder as far as how legitimate the paperwork is and how confident you can be that it really accurately represents what your boa is. And so this brings us to the last, number 12, the 12th thing that your boa breeder probably doesn't want you to know, and that's the unfortunate fact that boa breeding and keeping, and basically all reptile keeping, is threatened. And there are numerous numerous factors which could spell the end of reptile keeping as we know it. I actually did a video on this topic, so check that out if you want more information and discussion. But most people don't want you knowing that, you know, by the time the baby boas that you buy from them are at breeding age, it might be illegal to keep boas anyway. There are numerous threats from emerging diseases and parasites to laws which are overly restrictive on keeping boas, to the rising costs of boa keeping supplies and restrictions on shipping boas by FedEx and by other means, which unfortunately might spell the end of boa keeping in the not too distant future. And so, you know, one thing that happened within the last 10 years was that several large constricting snakes, including Burmese pythons, reticulated pythons, and anacondas, were added to the Lacey Act. And this effectively banned interstate shipments of these animals. So if you were a breeder in California, you couldn't sell your offspring to anybody in Nevada. You had to keep it just in California. So because of this, it didn't make sense for people in a lot of the smaller states to breed some of these animals because there would be no market. You know, they might have a litter of green anacondas, but you know, they're living in Delaware and they can't sell it to anybody outside of Delaware. How many people in Delaware are, you know, shopping for a green anaconda? So it was a way to try to kind of strangle reptile breeders and to try to basically effectively ban these species. And in fact, the people that pushed for this legislation were trying to get boas on the list. And this is back like in 2012, 2013. A lot of people were really concerned at the time that boas would be added and that, you know, the trade in boas would be effectively shut down. So ultimately, boas were never added to the list, but there were something like 9 other species of large constrictor that were. And for a few years, it was effectively illegal to ship snakes, so a lot of people had to really redefine their breeding efforts and get out of, you know, certain projects. But luckily for us all, the U.S. Association of Reptile Keepers, or USARK, sued and got the law overturned. So these animals are no longer on the Lacey Act and they can be shipped across state lines, including the green anacondas and the reticulated pythons. However, the people that are pushing for these bans, they will not stop, and they will not stop until all reptiles are illegal, and some of them until all animals are illegal, including things like cats and dogs and horses, because effectively they want to stop any use of animals by humans for any reasons. And in fact, there have recently been some efforts on the part of these people to overturn the ruling that reversed adding these 9 large constrictors to the Lacey Act and thus reinstate the ban on interstate transport. And so unfortunately, these people, they're just not going to stop. The reptile keepers have to keep fighting them if we want to retain our rights to keep and breed these amazing animals. And that's only one of many reasons why reptile keeping and breeding, unfortunately, might be doomed in the not too distant future, although I certainly hope this doesn't happen. So that was 12 things that your boa breeder probably doesn't want you to know. I know some of these things are a little controversial, so I wasn't trying to ruffle any feathers, and certainly this doesn't apply to all boa breeders, but there are definitely some out there that you really want to ask more questions of, and think about these things if you're going to be buying their boa offspring. So I hope you enjoyed the video and it was informative. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Shoot me any questions you may have. Thanks for watching and enjoy your boas.